You are calling us to follow. You are calling us to trust. You are seeing all our tomorrows. Greater things are yet to come. You will lead us to new horizons.
With today's sermon in our series, Follow Me, the life and teachings of Jesus, here's Senior Pastor Mark Rader.
As we come to the end of this series, which we've been going through for quite a while now, we've come to the point in time where we really need to talk about faith. There have been two central ideas that we've been grappling with throughout this entire series. The first is that anyone can begin to follow Jesus. Jesus makes no demands, puts no conditions on people, on their understanding or their faith and belief, or even their behavior to begin to follow him. But alongside that, we've also been saying again and again that if you begin to follow Jesus, eventually you are going to come to a point in time where you're going to have to make some kind of decision about what you believe about him. And that's the decision and crisis of faith. And so as we get closer to the end of this series, we want to take some time to talk a little bit more about faith in a little bit more detail. And faith has played a fairly important role in Matthew's gospel. It's been fairly significant in the place of how people have been healed. A number of people have been healed according to their faith. In one instance, Jesus was not able to heal because there was not enough faith. He has mentioned on a couple of occasions that for those who have faith, all things are possible. And right off the bat, you might think, oh, well, I don't have that much faith then because things seem impossible for me most of the time. But before you despair, just keep in mind that the disciples who stayed with Jesus the most, who heard him teach and preach the most, who watched him do things most frequently, are often described by Jesus as having little faith. And he never sends them away. He never says to them, listen, I've had it. You've been with me too long, and there's still not enough faith. Off you go. So if you're sitting there thinking, I'm not sure how much faith I have, don't despair. Jesus does not send anyone away until they, shall we say, choose to turn aside. But this passage is one of two examples that Jesus provides us, that Matthew provides us with, of model faith. One is in chapter 8 when a centurion displays faith, and the other is here with this Canaanite woman. And it's one of my favorite stories, as I mentioned. It's one of my favorite stories because Jesus is so unexpected, and so is this woman. But there's something in this story that tells us something really significant about faith. On the surface, it's a fairly straightforward story, isn't it? This woman who is in need because her daughter is suffering comes to Jesus, and eventually Jesus heals her daughter. What's unexpected is how he goes about doing it. But she comes with a degree of faith, and Jesus responds to her faith by healing her daughter. So we want to take some time to have a look at this. And there's a few things, as I said, that this illustrates about faith. And I think the first thing to remind ourselves about once again is that faith can grow in the most unlikely places. I don't know if you remember the parable that Jesus tells about the soils. He tells a story about a farmer who goes out and throws seed all over the place. And when I say all over the place, I mean all over the place. He gets some on the good soil, which is good, but he also gets some in the weeds, which is less good because it grows up and is choked by the weeds. He again lands some on the really shallow, rocky soil, which begins to grow, but then withers eventually because it has no root. And he even gets some on the footpath, where the birds just eat it up. And Jesus makes the point that the seed is the word. It's the gospel. It's his teaching. It's who he is. And it seems that there's something quite significant about how this farmer sows the seed. He throws it everywhere because you never know where it might grow. We've all seen flowers and plants growing in good soil. We're not surprised. But we've also seen plants growing in the cracks of sidewalks, right? In between paving stones. Places where you would think that's not a great place for plants. But it seems to be where they flourish, at least at my house, right? They do much better there than in the garden, to tell you the truth, right? This seems to be part of what Jesus is on about. Sowing the word as far and wide as you can because you never know where it's going to find some good soil. And this woman is an example of an unlikely place for faith. For Jews of the first century, there were two groups of people. There were Jews, and then there was everybody else. And everybody else were called Gentiles, right? You might be familiar with the language. Matthew goes one step further. He doesn't just say Jesus was outside of Jewish territory and then a woman from the region who we might expect was a Gentile comes to him. And he doesn't even say that he was outside of Jewish territory and a Gentile woman came. He actually goes a little bit further and says a Canaanite woman. This woman is a Gentile's Gentile, can I put it that way? I mean, it was bad enough to be a Gentile, but to be a Canaanite was one step further removed. And what Matthew is doing is emphasizing how outside she really was. It would be sort of like if I were to introduce someone to you and say that they were an asylum seeker or a refugee. That's a loaded term for us, isn't it, in Australia in particular? It's got all sorts of political baggage, but it emphasizes the outsider status. It's different even than saying someone who has immigrated to Australia, isn't it? To say that someone's a refugee. Matthew has taken a word that really expresses an outsider. And so it's a little bit surprising that we find faith in this unlikely source. But can I just point out, it's not completely unexpected. If you go back to the very beginning of Matthew's gospel, he opens his gospel with a genealogy. A sure way to just really suck readers in, isn't it? You know, so-and-so begat such and such, who begat so-and-so, who begat such and such, and it just goes on and on. Like nothing like that to really grab people's attention. But there are 5 women who are mentioned in that genealogy, which for our standards isn't very many because we're sure that more than 5 women were involved. But in the first century, it's a heap of women. And what's interesting about 4 of them is that they are all outsiders. And 3 of them in particular, Tamar, and Rahab and Ruth, are Canaanites or Moabites. And if possible, a Moabite's even worse than Canaanite if you kind of go back through the Old Testament. And all 3 of those women were not only people who had faith in God in some way, shape, or form, but were also brought into the family of God and ultimately participated in the line of Jesus, which is remarkable. So while this example is a little bit surprising, it's not completely out of the box. Faith can grow in the least or most unlikely places. But the second thing that we note about this woman's faith is that it is actually made visible for us through her need or because of the need that she has. You've all seen spy thrillers, right, where the hero or the heroine at some point has to get into a heavily guarded area, and inevitably there are infrared beams that cannot be seen, and so they use smoke or powder or something to show the red beams so they can avoid them. You've all seen that scene, or probably several times, right? In this story, it's the woman's need that makes her faith visible for us. Without the need of her daughter, without the suffering that her daughter was undergoing, there would be absolutely no reason for her to seek Jesus out. It's actually her need that makes her faith visible. It actually, shall we say, exposes the foundations of what she actually believes. And this reminds us also, not just the importance of that need, but also that faith is ultimately personal. Faith is much more about who you know than what you know. Faith is not just a whole bunch of kind of things that you have to believe and propositions that you agree to, as much as it is a belief in who Jesus is. And this woman's need, her suffering daughter, drives her, impels her, brings her to Jesus with what she believes about him, with, can I put it this way, with her faith. But I think that the most significant aspect of her faith that Matthew wants to draw out is her persistence. And this is what I want to take some time to really focus on, because she is persistent, if nothing else, isn't she? I don't know if you can kind of picture the scene here, but imagine Jesus and his disciples walking down the road. They're trying to have a conversation. I mean, there's already 13 of them, so that's like a fair mob of people to have a conversation with. And then there's this woman who is, we presume, kind of walking along with them, sort of, crying out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Again and again and again and again. And it's hard enough to have a conversation without someone yelling on the outside. And eventually the disciples come to Jesus and they say to Jesus, "Would you just send her away? Just send her away." And this is where the story gets a little bit strange. The woman shows great persistence. And she shows persistence, and it's kind of in this give and take relationship, if I can put it this way. Because Jesus responds to his disciples in a really curious fashion. This is where the story gets really interesting as far as I'm concerned. They say, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." And Jesus' answer is not to send her away, is it? But he doesn't actually say she should stop crying out. He doesn't actually do anything for her. He simply says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. This is a reference to the fact that his ministry was focused on the people of Israel. The mission to the Gentiles, to the rest of the world, would come later. But Jesus spent most of his time, and we see it in the Gospels, most of his time in Jewish territory ministering to Jewish people. He says, I was sent to the lost people of Israel. That's his reason. His reason for not answering her, but he doesn't send her away. Interesting, isn't it? And then she, I think, we have no evidence of this, but I think that she actually not only hears the disciples say, send her away, but also hears Jesus say what he says, because she eventually finds her way to get to Jesus, falls down on her knees and says, Lord, help me. And Jesus responds in a really odd fashion, doesn't he? Because we're used to how these stories unfold, aren't they? Someone cries out, Jesus, help me, and Jesus says, how can I help you? And they say, well, this is how you can help me. And Jesus says, well, let me help you. And the end of the story, right? It's lovely. Here, someone has cried out, Jesus, help me. And Jesus responds by saying, it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Which sounds a little bit like he's just called her a dog, doesn't it? Which doesn't sound very Jesus-like when it comes right down to it. I mean, that sounds a little bit out there. So we have to kind of figure out what's going on here. Now, once again, Jesus is acting, shall we say, kind of quite typically because he speaks in a parable. Jesus often spoke indirectly. He very rarely told people exactly what he wanted to say. He would often use a story or some sort of comparison. And this is a comparison. And it's really another parable that outlines the principle that he had mentioned to his disciples. I was sent to the people of Israel. Here, he just kind of talks about the priority. I've been sent to the people of Israel, not to the Gentiles. And so he uses this example of a meal. It's not right to take the children's bread and their food and give it to the dogs. Like if you have pets and children and only enough to feed one of them, go with your children, right? It's a matter of priority. This is kind of how this whole thing works out, right? So Jesus is not necessarily calling her a dog, but he is using a fairly curious methodology, isn't he? He could have actually done a number of things that talked about priority. Like he could have said, well, it's not right to put your shoes on and then try to put your socks on, right? You get one after the other. There's an order to it. Or to stick with the meal, he could have said it's not right to have your dessert before you finish your vegetables, right? There's this priority that takes place. But either way, the fact that he uses a parable reminds us why Jesus did that. And he used parables to invite people to engage with him further. He used parables, as one scholar talks about them, as discussion starters. Because if you ask someone a question and they give you an odd answer, you're either going to do one of two things. You're either going to go, oh, for crying out loud, and walk away, or you're going to ask, what do you mean by that? And the what did you mean by that is a response, ultimately, of faith. And so Jesus does not send her away, and that invites her to approach him. And then he speaks in a parable, and that invites her to answer back. Jesus invites faith, which is why I think she's so persistent. She's persistent because Jesus is always on the lookout for faith. He reaps what he sows, and he sows the seed wherever he can in the hope that it might grow someplace. And so when stuff begins to grow, he's always on the lookout for it, right? This is what takes place in this story. And this woman then expresses her faith in Jesus. She actually states what she believes about him, doesn't she? She enters into the parable, first of all. I think it's a remarkable answer. First of all, she says to Jesus, she contradicts him. How good is that? Jesus says it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs, and she says, yes, it is. What kind of parent are you to say that you should, never mind. It's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. She says, yes, it is. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Isn't that a great response? And what is she saying about Jesus? She's actually saying something quite important, isn't she? She's saying that, Jesus, you can help me, and the help that I need from you, even though my need is massive and no one else can help me, what it will take for you to help me won't even be missed. The children, they can have all they like. I'm not going to take anything. I'm not going to take any food from their mouths. No one's going to begrudge me the crumb. All I'm asking for is not even the leftovers, just the stuff that falls on the ground that the dogs eat up. That's all I need from you. I don't need anything else. I don't need anything else. And remember, this story is tucked between two other stories, the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. In both cases, Jesus provides, he over-caters, and there are 12 baskets and 7 baskets of crumbs. And in between is the story of this woman who gets it. She gets it. And Jesus responds, "Woman, you have great faith, and your request is granted." And her daughter, we're told, was healed from that hour. It's a remarkable story of faith, isn't it? And it begs, I think, a handful of questions for us to grapple with as we reconsider our own response to Jesus. One of them is simply this: what do you need from Jesus? What do you need from Jesus? You see, it's our need that makes our faith visible, because it's our need that brings us to Jesus in the first place. And you know, we've been talking about this crisis of faith, and the reason why there is a crisis of faith, the reason why we have to make a decision about Jesus, is because Jesus keeps saying these outrageous things about what he is able to provide. He says things like, "I can forgive your sins," which begs the question, do you need forgiveness? Do you experience guilt and regret? Do you experience condemnation? Do you suffer from a crippling anxiety that people will find out about you? Do you need freedom from sin? Well, Jesus says he can provide that. Jesus says that he can provide healing. Do you need healing? Physical healing, spiritual healing, emotional healing. Do you need that? Because Jesus claims he can provide that. Jesus claims, when he talks about his own death, that he will establish a new relationship with God that will ultimately transform hearts and minds until they obey God and his will as if it were second nature to them. Do you need that kind of transformation? Is there anything in your heart and in your mind that continually drags you away from God? Do you want that changed? Because Jesus promises that he can do that. He can provide that. And it's these sorts of statements that Jesus makes about himself that ends up causing for us the crisis of faith. Because he makes this outrageous claim. And we're left to ask ourselves, well, do I believe that? What do you need from Jesus? And this is important not just for those of you who might be exploring what faith in Jesus looks like, who have begun following him as we've been talking about, but you're not quite sure whether you believe or not. That's a question you need to grapple with as well. But even if you placed your faith in Jesus, what do you need from him? Because faith does not stop being a who you know rather than a what you know. And we can end up being in church long enough that we end up with this list of what we knows. I know all this stuff about Jesus. What do you need from Jesus? Because faith is personal. Faith is personal. And what you need from Jesus will make your faith visible. Here, of course, is I think where we find ourselves caught in a little bit of a tricky spot, isn't it? Because we might be able to identify what we need. We might be very clear about our need for freedom or renewal, or for peace, or for guidance, or for a job, or for something to share with that friend who's asked a difficult question, or whatever it might be. We might be very, very clear on our need. But then we're asked to bring our faith to Jesus, and we think to ourselves, I don't know what I believe about Jesus. And here's where I want to make another point about Jesus and his interaction with faith. Because Jesus always is inviting faith and is always on the lookout for it, but Jesus is ultimately very sensitive to faith as well. Ever see a seismograph? It's one of those kind of long metal arms that kind of measures the tremors within the earth. And if there's ever an earthquake, it kind of does this whole thing, right? You know that there's an earthquake because that's happening, probably also because the room is shaking, but that'll certainly tell you, right? The thing about those lines, though, is it's not as if they go kind of dead straight and then do this, right? So there's nothing happening and then earthquake. There's nearly always some kind of movement in the earth that you and I don't even register, right? We don't kind of walk around losing our balance because the earth is shaking on us, right? But the earth is always moving. We are not sensitive enough to that, and so we have these machines that can actually pick up that movement. Jesus is ultra sensitive to faith. I mean, think about this woman for a moment. I mean, Jesus has listened to her, and he's basically done this, right? He's listened to her response and gone, whoa, that is great faith. Wow, that's a seismic shift. But think about what she actually knew about Jesus. She's a Canaanite from the region of Tyre and Sidon, outside of Jewish territory, in a time period where very few people read, and even if they did read, they didn't have access to books. How likely is it that she had read the Hebrew Scriptures? How likely was it that she understood that Jesus was the fulfillment of prophecy? How likely was it that she had any kind of grasp at all of God's plan for the world? How likely was it that she actually obeyed the law of Moses or had any insight in it at all? How likely was it that she had any kind of really significant, monstrous, identifiable faith that you and I would have looked at and gone, wow? I think it's much more likely that just like the little arm was hardly moving, we would have missed it entirely. Unlikely place, right? Now, she's not going to have any faith, seriously? But Jesus is super, super sensitive to it. And as soon as she responds, whoa, wow, you have great faith. You have great faith. So when we come to Jesus with our needs, whatever they may be, all we can do really is bring whatever we believe about him to the table. What do you believe about Jesus? Do you believe that he can change your life? Would you like to believe that he could change your life? Do you believe he can actually set you free from the guilt and regret and shame that you feel? Or do you hope that he might be able to? What do you believe about Jesus? Because not only does Jesus invite us to persist and come with our needs before him, but he is super sensitive to even the least amount of faith in our lives. And most importantly still, when there is faith, Jesus responds to it. If I could put it this way, Jesus is a bit of a sucker for faith. Any kind of faith at all. And Jesus responds. He responds to the faith that he finds in people's lives. And so while we may need the faith of a mustard seed to cast mountains into the ocean, as Jesus talks about, perhaps we don't need that much at all to come before him with our need. And whatever belief we have about him, unformed, immature, underdeveloped, not particularly clear, and who knows what Jesus will do in response to that faith. This woman's story is an example to us of faith growing in unlikely places. Perhaps you think of yourself as an unlikely candidate. Maybe you think of yourself as, I'm not the spiritual type. I'm not really into religion. I don't have the right background. I've never really thought too much about it. Whatever it might be. Don't be surprised, though, if faith begins to grow in your life. And don't be surprised if Jesus responds to your need. Don't be surprised if Jesus responds to the faith that you have, even if you feel it is insignificant, because Jesus is always inviting faith, and he is always sensitive to it. And who knows what Jesus will do in response to your faith.
We hope you've enjoyed today's New Horizons program. You can download the companion study guides for each program from the Guymer Baptist Church website. Go to guymerbaptist.org.au/New Horizons. These are available for each episode, or you can download the whole series. Guymer Baptist Church in Sydney's southern suburbs is a contemporary evangelical church. seeking to serve our local community and help them to know Jesus. At the heart of all we do is the desire to help people love God in all aspects of their lives. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so via the contact page on our website or visit our Facebook page.
The story of the Canaanite woman in Matthew chapter 15 is essentially about faith. And faith on two sides. On the one hand, you have this woman, one of the most unlikely characters in Scripture to have faith, and yet she demonstrates faith. And she demonstrates her faith not only in taking her need to Jesus, but also in her persistence. But on the other hand, you have Jesus. Jesus who invites faith to come towards him, to invite people with faith to approach him, and then also to be super sensitive to whatever faith is found. Whether it's fully formed or only partially formed, Jesus will respond to the faith that we have. So what do you need from Jesus this week, today? Bring your faith to him, because he will provide according to the faith that he finds in your life. I hope you've been encouraged by this. We hope to see you again real soon. God bless.